Hi, students. Good to see you again. Thanks for joining and clicking and zooming in on this lecture. I know this is what we do, and this is the second imperialism lecture of two. So now after this one, we're finishing up our imperialism lecture. We are going to start on World War I. So we're moving through history. We're trying to do the best we can. Thanks for getting the content through lectures and then coming to class and doing activities in class. Is just trying to build in just a base knowledge, right? That's all we can kind of hope for right now and do to the best of our abilities. So thanks for being here and for trying to do your best under the circumstances. And we might be at this a long time, obviously, with Inslee's new protocols. He says they'll be for a month, and we hope that numbers go down and the vaccine comes out soon to eradicate the numbers and basically let us come back to school. So, but as it's a rainy Monday, getting our rains in. But anyways, it's not raining on U.S. history. It's always interesting stuff to find out and figure out. So thanks for taking notes on this lecture, and we'll have a couple more for World War I as well. So if you remember where we left off last time, we left off talking about sort of President McKinley. We didn't really talk about this, but it was really the Spanish-American War and how the Spanish-American War is going to be one of the most pivotal events that catapults America into a global stage, worldwide stage. And of course, we had traded with countries for centuries, especially Great Britain, our mother country, and other countries. So we had economic ties around the world. We had political ties around the world, even though we're not necessarily going to fight in the world's sort of wars at the time, especially Europe. We want to stay out of that. And the Monroe Doctrine in the early 1800s really cements that of us staying out of Europe's problems and they're staying out of our problems. So that kind of starts to change, sort of our role in the world begins to change really with the Spanish-American War, in which we acquire new territories. We purchase the Philippines, which become a territory, and they fight a revolution against American forces. And so we really kind of surrender authority there, but we possess Guam and some other Spanish possessions, including Cuba for a bit of time. And so we'll talk more about sort of the other areas we're involved in. But just like you guys have said in lecture and the 8 sort of regions America has influence in these areas, you guys did a great job on your slides and presentations. So you did a lot better than kind of what I'm going to cover in lecture. But so as another important segue in American history, besides the Spanish-American War, is our president at the time is assassinated and ushers in the vice president who becomes president, Teddy Roosevelt. And so here's President McKinley. He goes and he speaks at, I believe it's one of the World's Fairs. I think it was in Detroit, Michigan. And he ends up getting, maybe it's upstate New York, actually, now I think about it. But while he's there, and what's interesting about him, he's not an advocate of imperialism. So he doesn't want to necessarily expand outside of the lower 48 states. There's going to be people that encourage him to do so, including members of the Congress that want to see our influence expand. But as he's at this World's Fair, he ends up kind of shaking hands and meeting people. So one guy that ends up coming up in meeting, trying to meet the president, is an anarchist. His name escapes me right now, but he wrapped a gun in sort of a handkerchief, walks up to the president to meet him. The president goes out to shake his hand, and he basically shoots him point blank in the stomach. And so the president, William McKinley, is whisked away, and he's basically bedridden for days, and he ends up dying. He gets shot to the gut. They try to perform surgery, and they really can't stop the internal bleeding that's happening. And so he ends up dying. And so his vice president, who was our victor in the Spanish-American War and uses sort of that stature as a war hero from that war to rise in political power, becomes McKinley's vice president. And so really becomes a very popular man to become vice president. But then when McKinley's assassinated, he becomes president, right? That's what happens when you're a vice president and the president dies. And so we've already talked about President Roosevelt. So just sweeping changes within America itself. He's considered our our first progressive president, in that he's going to try to take power away from corporations, take power away from businesses, and people manipulating the stock market, and really return it back to people, give people in America more power. So really revolutionary in that way. And he's a Republican, so he's going to really champion the cause of minorities and minority rights, unlike any president that had done really since Lincoln. And so he's a very strong figure, and on the international stage, very strong figure as well, looking outside of the United States. And he's been highly critiqued and criticized for what he does outside of our borders. But he has a profound impact there as well. So he's the youngest person to serve as president until JFK gets elected in 1960. Very colorful personality, and we kind of talked about that, and we talked about how he broke up monopolies and passed the Pure Food and Drug Act, and he ended up being the uncle of Eleanor Roosevelt. So that's his niece, and then his niece is going to marry another future president of his same name, and that's Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who's our president from 1932 till 1945. And so we'll talk about him as we get to the Great Depression and World War II. So they're not from, like, they're from the same family tree. They have the same grandparents, but then as it's trickled down, so they're like, you know, distant cousins, like fourth cousins. I can't exactly remember, but so on Roosevelt's side is Eleanor Roosevelt, who their parents are siblings. And so that's then the other side. So when you're at the Thanksgiving table and you see your distant relatives, but probably not this year because of our restrictions on COVID, you know, you just never know. You know, second cousin, third cousins, they're legal to marry in Washington State, just as a heads up. So it happened for the Roosevelt family. Maybe it can happen for you too. But so one of his biggest landmark international decisions is acquiring a piece of land in the country of Panama. It wasn't the country at this time. It was technically a territory of Colombia, the neighboring country to Panama. But to acquire this piece of land where for about 100 years, surveyors, explorers have known that this is the closest, smallest piece of land that connects the Atlantic Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. And for over 100 years, European countries have been trying to acquire this land so that they could slice through it and build a canal to be able to connect both oceans and improve transportation and access around the world. So why did America have an interest in building a canal? Well, it would have given us greater mobility for both our naval fleets, so our battleships being able to get, you know, to both coasts, right? We're a both coast country, and so we want to have better access to get to either side, and then also give our merchant fleets, our trading networks, economic networks around the world, greater mobility as well. We also want to protect our growing colonial empire now. We're not necessarily colonial power where we're setting up colonies all over, but we're sort of fostering relationships, starting new democracies, and trying to influence and sway local populations that we're going to come to control in this imperialism time period. And then number three, you also want to increase commerce with East Asia, which is seen as basically being the wealth of a lot of trade goods, a lot of interest in industries like silk or porcelain or jade, those types of trades coming out of East Asia. And we're trying to get there and have a greater relationship with China and Japan as well. So you see, if we had the Panama Canal, which cut through Panama, it would decrease the travel time by 2/3 to go, instead of going all the way around South America to get from coast to coast of America, which you could do the train too, but it's a lot easier to go via water. This is going to cut that route in half by 2/3. So you can see there's just a major reason to want this land to build a canal. And so we're going to try some fair steps. Roosevelt's going to try some fair steps. This really becomes one of the first things he cites as president when he becomes president is, I want to take this over. I want to accomplish this. And so at first, the United Kingdom and Great Britain was in partnership with the U.S. to try to take control of this land, which never happened. That's the Hay-Bulwer Treaty. You don't need to remember that. But then eventually the UK drops out. So they're become increasingly focused on what's going on in Europe and the stuff's leading into World War I in Europe. And they got a bigger empire to control than America does. So they're just like, you know, Western Hemisphere, America, all right, we're not going to care so much about that. And so they drop out. And so the UK uh, isn't around, but it's just the US that then starts to patchwork sort of this discussion together with Colombia, who owns Panama at the time, and say, hey, we'll give you just a bootload of money. So $10 million up front and $250,000 every year just for access to this piece of land so that we can build a canal. We're not even saying you have to build it. We'll build the canal. Just let us have access to the land. So it seems like a sweet deal. No one would ever turn it down. Well, the Colombian Senate rejects it. And they're just like, no, this is our land. We have the opportunity to build a canal. This is going to be for us. And so what does Roosevelt do? He just kind of like backstabs Colombia in the back and is like, fine, you know, you are holding this territory of Panama that is not technically your territory. These Panamanian people should be free and independent. And so what I'm going to do is sponsor a little revolution. I'm going to send them support to these militias that are against you, Colombia, and they're going to advocate for a free and independent Panama, which they do. And so the Panamanians have a revolution. And so it starts in Panama, and we're going to encourage it, not necessarily with troops, but with financial aid and with weapons to these militias fighting against the Colombians and the occupation of Panama. And so they end up winning after a 2-year kind of insurrection and rebellion and fight. And so Panama wins its independence and becomes a democratic country, which, you know, we're thankful for. Yeah, democracy is spreading. And so in sort of to compensate us for our help, Panama says, okay, yeah, you indeed can have control of this land that is eventually going to be the Panama Canal. So we are given a 10-mile strip of land through Panama to help build this canal. And then we also were given the authority to intervene in Panama anytime. And then instead of paying Colombia, we now pay Panama these great financial terms, $10 million up front and $250,000 a year, all the way up until the year 2000. So, but in the Treaty of 1977, this was signed by Jimmy Carter in 1977. We agreed, yeah, it's kind of weird to have the strip of land that we've been controlling for almost 100 years now. And, you know, it's not on our native territory. So, yeah, we'll give it back to you, Panama. Go ahead and have it in the year 2000. And we did in the year 2000. The United States gave Panama back control, full control of the canal. But the canal is supposed to remain neutral. So anyone can go through it, no matter what country, no matter who's at war. You're allowed, once you pay the $1,500, and it might be larger depending on what cargo and what kind of ships going through there, but you're allowed to go through the canal if you pay your toll fees, your lock fees. So, okay. And so also Roosevelt is going to expand the influence of America abroad with what he calls the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. So if you remember the Monroe Doctrine, we were telling Europe, hey, you stay involved in your affairs in the Eastern Hemisphere. We're in the Western Hemisphere. Well, Roosevelt's going to add to that and say, not only are you staying out, but he was seeing European influence continue, especially to affect the Caribbean and Latin America. And so he says, hey, you stay out. I told you to stay out. And in fact, we are the international police power in the Western Hemisphere. So we're going to go to these countries like the Dominican Republic and Puerto Rico and Cuba, and we are going to help them and help them especially kick out you and your influence, Europe. So get out. And so here's this cartoon. Here's Roosevelt rolling up in his great white fleet, these battleships that were some of the strongest in the world at the time. They're all painted white to just symbolize how kind of great these battleships are and America's military might. And so, but this has this cannon barrel pointing down at England, who's trying to make a claim to the Dominican Republic. And we're just like, no. Teddy's like, no, that's not our role. Get out of your spot. You're not supposed to be here. And so we did, in fact, sort of spread our influence into Teddy Roosevelt's presidency to just continue to expand and influence countries outside of the lower 48 states. So here, especially in Central America or in the Caribbean, is where we're going to expand influence. We're going to have, as you guys mentioned, sort of mini skirmishes in Mexico, trying to control them and seek to have influence over Mexico. But then Cuba, all these purple regions become U.S. protectorates, or areas that we protect and have heavy influence over and kind of dictate how things go for them. We encourage them all to have democracies, but we also heavily kind of write portions of the democracy to favor America and a special relationship with America. So here's Panama, even Nicaragua, but Cuba, which we talked about in the Spanish-American War, and then Dominican Republic. Puerto Rico becomes an American territory by way of the SPAM War, Spanish-American War. U.S. Virgin Islands we end up purchasing, and so heavily influencing the Caribbean and Latin America during this imperialism time period. And also in the Pacific, when we have the Philippines and Hawaii, and even Alaska's in the Pacific Ocean, it increased influence there as well. Not so much in the Eastern Hemisphere, in Europe, Africa, sort of West Central Asia. We don't really have much influence there. That builds after World War II, and we become really the world superpower against the USSR, that we build more relationships in the Eastern Hemisphere. So couple just notes, both for Alaska and Hawaii. So Alaska is first settled by Europeans in 1732. Really, the Russians are there. They set up small Russian settlements where they're fur trading and trading with natives, different goods. So it's just economic reasons is why they first settled. And it was not very profitable Russian colony. So it was technically Russian territory that then they sold to the United States in 1867. This is 2 years after we come out of the Civil War for $7.2 million, which was a lot of money then. It was called Seward's Folly because our Secretary of State, William Seward, was the one that negotiated this treaty, or it was called Seward's Icebox because it was just a bunch of ice in Alaska, right? But so it was for $7.2 million, which is about 2 cents per acre, because it's a huge area of land. And just to give you an example, like here's the map of the lower 48 states compared to the size of Alaska. But come to find out, ever since we purchased it, it's just been a bounty of natural resources that have been given to America, whether you talk about oil or timber or minerals like gold that we're finding there, or even fish. So I'm sure you've had some Copper River salmon before that's in Alaska. And so just an abundance of resources, right, that have encouraged American industry and growth. So it became a U.S. territory after we purchased it in 1867, and then becomes a state in 1959. Okay, 1959. And then Hawaii becomes a state after Alaska does. So this is our 50th state. But originally it's a collection of islands, right? And maybe you've been to one or a couple of the islands of Hawaii. So it's a collection of islands that originally was conquered and taken over by King Kamehameha the First. So he was the one that spread from one island and then conquered this whole island chain that has become Hawaii now. And so as he conquers and unites all these Hawaiian islands together under his leadership, that's when Europeans start arriving, first with James Cook, who has a bad interaction. James Cook actually gets killed by the Hawaiians because he tries to steal away one of the Hawaiian princesses, and didn't bode well for him. It wasn't him himself, but some of his men. And so a battle erupts and he ends up losing his life there. But we also see, as now it's discovered by Europeans, it sort of increases a network of people discovering and also going into the Pacific Ocean to trade for things there. And so we see the arrival of Europeans from 1778. So this is after kind of America has declared its independence. We're fighting a Revolutionary War in this time, but all the way up until 1887, especially businessmen are there. Missionaries are going to flood into the Hawaiian kingdom. And so by 1887, there's a minority of white businessmen predominantly, who forced the king, kind of blackmail him to sign a constitution that gave power of the royal monarchy away to the small ruling group. Okay, and so fast forward 6 years later, and there's ongoing struggle between the kingdom and the native Hawaiians against the small white elite. That is a group that's armed themselves and even used the Marines to help them stay in power. And so 6 years later, they end up overthrowing the queen. The former king who signed the Constitution ends up passing away, King Lunalilo, excuse me. And then his sister ends up taking over, and her name's Queen Liliuokalani. She ends up getting overthrown because it was seen that she was trying to take back power. So they used that just to be like, well, you're violating the Constitution, you're under house arrest, and we're going to take over and kick out the monarchy, the Hawaiian monarchy. So eventually gets annexed as a United States territory, because after the small group of businessmen take over and arm themselves, they start applying for help, first from America. And then when America's like, that you took it over in shady means, even though you're Americans, I necessarily don't agree with it. Then they start being like, okay, well, Great Britain, Germany, you want to come help us out here? And so then America's like, wait. Okay, well, you're American. Okay. All right. We'll come in and we'll annex Hawaii as a territory. And then August 21st, 1959 is when Hawaii becomes a state, even after Pearl Harbor is bombed in 1941. It's going to be another sort of 15 years or longer, 18 years after, before it gets annexed as a state, becomes a state. The U.S. Under President Clinton does issue an apology to the Hawaiian people, saying sorry for how America's involvement in taking you over and deposing the king and queen of Hawaii, and sorry about that. So no money was really exchanged. It just became an apology of, we realized it was kind of shady how we took you over, but and there's kind of it's a small minority, about 5 to 10% of the Native Hawaiians that want to reestablish the monarchy. So sometimes in various spots of Hawaii, you see a Hawaii native flag. It looks like a Rastafarian flag, but that kind of represents Hawaiian independence, free of U.S. intervention or any other intervention in the reestablishment of the royal monarchy, of which there's still royal descendants that are still alive. So, but again, it's about 5 to 10% of the Hawaiian population, the overwhelming, still want to be a part of America and see a relationship that still exists there. Okay. So, and this is our last slide. So again, here's sort of just a big picture over the Pacific and the Caribbean, Latin America, big picture of America's influence and expansion during this imperialism time period. So we're not, going to go over to China and take that over, Japan, but Philippines, Guam, and we have all these smaller island chains, Hawaii, Alaska, then even here in Central America and the Caribbean. So tremendous influence expanding during this imperialism time period. So we're going to see sort of our influence change. And now as Europe is going to get involved in a war there, that's going to encompass Europe and Africa and Asia, we're going to have this big decision of, are we going to go to war as well and truly make it a world war? And we are eventually going to get forced into that, have our hands tied into joining World War I. So that's where we're going to go on our next lecture. But we start to see American influence and power continue to grow in the early 1900s, and it continued to expand into the mid 1900s all the way up till today. We are still the world's largest superpower. Okay, and so we'll continue to talk about that in the last 100 years. So thanks again for tuning in. I'll see you in class next time.